This goes along with kind of checking that ego. People go, well, my time is worth it. And you have to really scrutinize that. It's a tough question to ask yourself. You have to go, is my time really worth it? Is the service that I'm providing bringing enough value to justify the price that I'm charging? We have to be realistic as business owners too. And we can't let that ego get ahead of us and dictate what we're going to charge, right? Because that will ultimately affect the business. Welcome to the Just Business Podcast. Today we are here. It's another solo episode. I am looking for more guests. Obviously, I know I've probably talked about it too much in previous episodes that, I do prefer doing the episodes with a guest so that we can kind of interview them and hear their story. But I'm coming here with some more interesting things that I've been learning recently and I thought might be cool to share with you guys and anybody here who is in the entrepreneurship space, artists, creatives, business owners. Because I've been doing some reading recently. This all started a few months ago. I found through one of my favorite comedians, Tom Segura. I found through his podcast, an author and I don't know if he'd consider himself a philosopher, kind of. But his name is Ryan Holiday. He does a lot of work in the field of Stoicism and like Stoic philosophy, which I have now since then been reading up on a lot. I actually have one of his books here today, The Daily Stoic, and I've been reading that. It's kind of like just short installments each day that you can read and get a little piece of like philosophy from. So I usually try to read that in the morning and kind of start my day with that. But since then, I've looked in a little bit more into his work and some of the other books that he's written, and I started reading one, quote unquote. I listened to it on Audible, full disclosure. I did not, I don't have time to read every single book, but I did listen to this book in full on Audible. And I wanted to bring some of the lessons from the book to the podcast today and kind of share them with you guys, because I think a lot of what he was saying in this book is very applicable to us as business owners, to entrepreneurs, artists, and it's applicable to a lot of people, but I want to keep it within the focus of entrepreneurship and business ownership today. And the book that I've been reading of his that I'm specifically going to be talking about is called Ego is the Enemy. Again, by Ryan Holiday. It's an amazing book. And by all means, even if you listen to this, it's not going to be a full summarization of the book, and I highly recommend that people go out, read it for themselves, think about it, because there's a lot of interesting details and things that he includes in the book that, obviously I can't cover with just a 1-hour podcast and talking about it for that. So yeah, definitely go pick it up, go read it, Audible, physical copy, whatever you like to do. I recommend it strongly for anybody who is an entrepreneur or an aspiring entrepreneur. It has really kind of helped my mindset in the way that I think about these things. And yeah, let's just get right into it. So to start, once again, the book is called Ego is the Enemy. It's primarily focused around the idea of ego as an internal thought and just how it really affects us as people. So just a quote from the author, Ryan. He said, "Ego is the enemy of what you want and of what you have, of mastering a craft, of real creative insight, of working well with others, of building loyalty and support, of longevity, of repeating and retaining your success. It repulses advantages and opportunities. It's a magnet for enemies and errors." And, I really like that quote. When I first heard it, it's so true, because even without getting into all of the philosophical thinking behind the ideas of ego, it is true, because I feel like everybody has probably a story in their life where they're like, I have allowed my pride or my ego to get the best of me, and it put me in a situation where maybe I would have been better off doing nothing. And it happens to everybody. And Another important thing to really highlight throughout this is that he never makes the claim that we can necessarily live without ego, because it is something that continuously kind of develops within us. Um, but the important thing to remember is that he says, we have to acknowledge and then try to mitigate that, which is very true. He actually, at the end of the book, he finishes it with a little bit of an analogy, I guess, or a reference. He says ego is kind of like sweeping the floor, in that, regardless of the last time you swept, dust and dirt will always collect on the floor again, and it will continuously need to be swept. And I thought that was really an interesting um, way to put it, because it really is true. It's like, as much as we can think about, becoming this person who is able to perfectly manage their emotions or their ego or whatever it is, um, we all are human at the end of the day, and it's a working process to continuously keep yourself in a space and a headspace and a state where you're able to, you know, properly properly mitigate that, right? So we have to be mindful of it. We have to continuously try to really, check ourselves. So I just wanted to kind of preface this by mentioning that, because again, I thought the whole entire book was very interesting, and those are just a few things that stuck out to me right at the beginning, and as like the most important things. But I'll get a little bit more deeper into the book now, explain kind of some of the sections of it, give you a couple of examples that he mentioned in the books that I thought were very interesting, and try to relate them back to more tangible business things. I want to definitely talk about some times that, even for myself with my own business, I've kind of let ego get the best of me, or maybe have, not been the best practitioner of this philosophy, if you want to call it that. So the book itself is broken up into 3 parts, and then within those parts, there's chapters. But the 3 main parts, part 1 being aspire, part 2 being success, and part 3 is failure. And these are, like, I guess, 3 different stages that most people have within their life. Even if you're not running a business, obviously people have their own aspirations, the things that they want to do, and you succeed and fail along with those throughout your time. But starting with the first section, I thought it was very interesting. It's very pragmatic, very practical, I would say, the way that he kind of laid out some of these chapters, because, you know, obviously anytime you have somebody, especially in business, who is starting a new venture, right? There's obviously a lot of aspirations, there's a lot of ideas. I know for me, like starting my business, I was, you try to plan for everything. I was watching YouTube videos trying to figure out all these perfect techniques. I was, you know, writing out my business plan, and trying to get all of the strategy together. And while that is important, and it is important to have a plan, right? He also kind of goes along with the fact that he mentions the fact that, you can only aspire for so long. I think one of the chapters is called Talk, 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 right? And in that chapter, he kind of talks about people who die in that cycle of, paralysis by analysis. Everybody wants you want to get it perfect. You want to try to plan out every single avenue, and then every single avenue off of that. It's like that Michael Scott bit, in The Office, where he's like, if I could just think this perfectly, and then I'll go down every avenue, and then I'll go down every avenue off of that avenue, and then everyone after that. It's like, people want to plan, because in some sense, I think subconsciously or consciously, people are afraid of failure, which we'll get into later, because that's a whole other section of his book. But he just goes along to say, like, while it's good to discuss and talk through some of the things that you want to do, it's even more important to actually go do those things. If you go out and you fail, the worst case scenario is you now have that experience, and you have one less thing that you're going to try to do in the future, right? If you if you run a business and then or you start a business and it fails because you were spending too much money too quickly on unnecessary things, you have that knowledge at least now, and you can use that in your next attempt, right? So the idea really behind that chapter is to kind of say, you know, go do the work, right? Stop talking about it, stop trying to plan everything perfectly, and just go do the thing. You can only talk about it for so long. And yeah, I mean, the rest of the section, he has another interesting story in there. I forgot exactly which chapter it was in. But basically, he talks about Benjamin Franklin when he was younger. He would publish letters in the local newspaper that his brother actually owned, but he would publish these letters under a fake name, and he would get them into the newspaper by sliding them under the print shop door in the middle of the night when nobody was there. So he didn't receive credit for these letters for a long time. Nobody knew it was him. You know, people began to actually enjoy these letters like a lot, because obviously at that time people heavily read the newspaper. There weren't many other forms of obtaining information or hearing stories or any of that, because everything was primarily just printed, or I guess live theatrical plays. But yeah, he went along and he kept posting or publishing these stories without any notice. And the moral of that story, as Ryan put it in the book, was really to focus on the work itself, which is really important. A lot of times, and this ties back into the ego, people do the work, but they do it for the recognition. People write the stories, or they start the business because they want to be the successful business owner. They want to be the millionaire, or the person who has a lot of money and people respect. They want that end result. But in that process, you kind of fail to see some of the more integral parts of that, right? Most people will not succeed if they take that route, right? There's a few that will, obviously there's always anomalies or outliers, but most people will not succeed through that route, because you're failing to focus on the most important part of what you're doing, which is the actual work. The process of doing the thing is more important than the result in a lot of ways. And he repeats that throughout the book in a few different sections. And that was really something that was, stood out to me as I was listening and going through each chapter. But he says, also in this like Benjamin Franklin story that he's telling and tying into the meaning that he's trying to portray, he's talking about it and saying, when you stop focusing on the work too, your work will be subpar if you don't focus on that process. Because when you first start doing something, like for example, when I first started M3 Merch, which is now Trim Merch, there was a large learning curve. And even to this day, I still learn things every day about different printing methods, different materials that I'm using, how these materials all interact with each other. But there's a large learning curve. And I think even more important in what he was trying to say is, like, if you don't just focus on learning about the craft that you're trying to, succeed in, then you're not going to be able to succeed, because the foundation of your success is kind of in you doing that thing properly. But yeah, I thought that was a very interesting story talking about Benjamin Franklin, because that was something I had never heard before. I do enjoy listening to different like history podcasts and reading about history, but I never heard about that. So that was actually kind of interesting for me to hear. And then a little side note, this kind of isn't really related to the ego thing. I looked this up afterwards, just on Google. Supposedly, I guess, eventually his brother found out about Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's brother found out about him submitting these letters and got very upset about it, because I guess I don't know if he was necessarily jealous or if he just felt like he was lied to. Um, but yeah, that was just something interesting, little side note. But yeah, and this all ties back into, I want to tie it back into like the entrepreneurial ego, right? Because I feel like a lot of people who start businesses, right? Obviously, you kind of do need to some degree a little bit of confidence or a little bit of ego behind that says like, I think I could do this. I could do this better than somebody else who might be doing this, or to some degree, you do need some of that internal motivation to get started. So I thought like this was the perfect pairing for small business owners because we do need to balance that because a little bit might not be too bad. I don't know what Ryan would say about that now, but I I would say a little bit of ego might not be too bad because it could be motivating, but I definitely agree with him also at the same time that we do need to primarily check that, because it might get you motivated to start something, but it doesn't always get you the result to bring that idea to fruition, to get it across the finish line, and to really succeed in what you're trying to do. So let me just see here. It says, so he said, like, I kind of related back that aspiration thing too, because he also mentions, you know, people, like I said, that entrepreneurial ego. He kind of does reference that in the aspire section, or that first part. And it made me think of like specifically, I see a lot of people today online, whether they're people trying to sell a course, they're super specialized in a certain area, and they're trying to convince people, right? Like a lot of, I've noticed this specifically in like the barber industry for some reason. I don't know. I don't have any real connection to that besides I do get my hair cut, but I've noticed a lot of that in the barbering industry where there's a lot of people thinking that they're owed a certain fee. I've seen that a lot. People posting like, always up your prices, always up your prices. And I don't necessarily agree with that because at a certain point, you know, there is still is a market to take into consideration. At a certain point, you will price yourself out of the market. Um, and beyond that, like the idea that you're just worth more money because you think you are, I think is pretty insane, I don't think anybody is worth more money just because they think they are, with maybe the exception of like you might be able to make some sort of argument for artists because their artwork is a lot more subjective, and that's a little bit of a different space compared to business. They have like they share some things, but it's not exactly a one-for-one comparison. But in terms of actual businesses, whether you're a person providing a barber service or a landscaper or a contractor, or you make t-shirts like me, um, you do have to be realistic in what you're charging, because people will go, a lot of these business gurus will tell you like your time is worth X amount and you need to get this for your time. And to a certain extent, your time is, you do have to account for the market, right? Your time is kind of worth what people are willing to pay for it, because I could hold up, I have a little, I have my cup here, right? I made this. I could say this cup is worth $3 million, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean anybody's going to come along and pay $3 million for it, So at a certain point, you do have to be a little bit reasonable, and that this goes along with kind of checking that ego, because people go, like I said, people go, well, my time is worth it, and you have to really scrutinize that. It's a tough question to ask yourself. You have to go, is my time really worth it? Is the service that I'm providing bringing enough value to justify the price that I'm charging? Is the product that I'm producing bringing enough value to justify the price that I'm charging? Like there's a bunch of things that, they might bring people value, but also like if you go and really break it down, there's a ceiling to that, and we have to be realistic as business owners too. And we can't let that ego get ahead of us and dictate what we're going to charge, right? Because that will ultimately affect the business. And bringing it back to that barber idea, it was kind of interesting because I actually went to get a haircut recently. And this place, I was going to another barber in White Plains, and he does an amazing job. He's very good at what he does. And I still would go back to him, but I I just happened to be in Yonkers, so I went to this random barber shop. The guy was, he was all right. He was charging $25 for a haircut, which is great compared to like what I was paying. Some of the other haircuts that I've gotten in the past were like, 40, 50, $60. Um, but it made me realize something because I also saw this too. And I think some people don't account for this either, right? Like I walked in there, it was 25 bucks, being that I could see what the price was. I wasn't expecting like some crazy like movie star style haircut that what was going to look super perfect, right? But the guy got me in the chair. He gave me a haircut. It was fine. There were a few little imperfections in my hair, whatever. But ultimately, it's hair. It grows back out, and most people aren't looking at the little details of how clean the fade is on your head, or is there a little, did he maybe go a little bit too shallow in one part. So it was interesting to see that because where I've seen a lot of people, especially in this industry, and I'm just looking kind of from the outside in this industry specifically, besides just being a customer. But I've noticed, like I said, a lot of people in that industry going along and saying like, you need to up your prices all the time, up your prices. Like it should be $45, $50 for a 30-minute service and blah blah blah, right? Like this guy got me in and out of the chair in 15 minutes. The haircut was fine. It wasn't an amazing haircut, but it wasn't terrible either, right? 15 minutes, gave him 25 bucks. And if you really want to break it down, like that guy had another guy behind me. So he made $50 in 30 minutes, right? But the difference is now he just did two customers, right? And because I only paid $25, I might go back a little bit sooner than I would if, let's say, I had to pay $50 or $60 for the haircut. So he's able to make pretty much the same amount of money as the barber who was charging $50 for a haircut. He spent the same amount of time, but the only difference is the cost for the consumer is a little bit lower. So now the consumer, your client, might come back a little sooner. In that sense, the guy who's charging less might actually end up making more money than, let's say, that specialty barber who's providing that premium service where they're washing your hair and shampooing it and all the enhancements and all the other stuff that I know people that they could offer. But it made me think, right? Like yeah, some people want to be that premium service, and I think that kind of comes along with a little bit of ego. Either people think like their work is so much better than the next guys, or maybe they've been doing it for a long time, and because of that, they think, oh, well, I've been doing this so long, I need to charge more because of the experience. And to that, I would also say like, you know, length of time doing something doesn't always correlate to the outcome. You could be doing something for 20 years, 30 years, but if you haven't been doing it properly and continuously learning, which we will get into in the next section, then you won't be at a level that justifies that rate, right? You could do something poorly for 20 years and you're still doing it poorly. The time that you put into that doesn't always correlate with what the value of that service is now. So just something interesting that I thought, especially as we think today in the age of everybody trying to specialize, like find their niche. Everybody's trying to, become this, I'm the specialty guy. I provide this premium service, right? Whereas some people just need to also acknowledge, you know, I'm the guy that provides a solid service. I'm not going to be the most expensive. I'm not going to be the cheapest, but I provide a solid service and I charge a fair price. And because of that, I have a strong client base that keeps coming back. And that's really all you can ask for too, because customer retention is one of the most important things that a business has. It's a lot cheaper to retain a customer than it is to continuously find new customers. And that's kind of also been something that, we've seen become an issue for a lot of businesses. If you can't keep the people that happy that are coming, and you can't keep them coming back, your business will most likely fail. You can keep spending marketing dollars on Google ads and whatnot to get new people to come in, but eventually that well dries up, and or you've just spent way too much money on advertising and now you're out of cash, in which case now the business closes. Um, and yeah, it's just overall, it's just really not sustainable. So going back to that idea, to the entrepreneurial ego and how we can like tangibly think about that, that is part of it, right? And with pricing, there's some other factors too, right? Like, yes, always first ask yourself, like, is this price worth it? And you can also kind of tell, because the the proof is well, how many people are willing to pay for it? If you are a barber who's charging $50 for a haircut, and you have people in and out of the chair all day long, then that's good on you. Obviously the skills and the talent that you have is justified, and what you're charging is justified, and it is um fair given the value that you're providing to people, because by having people come back, they're proving to you that your your service is valuable enough for the price that you're asking. So always first ask, am I charging the right price? Second question that I would ask is, well, is the client aware of the current market standards? Because that could be another issue too. Some people, you will get those people who, reach out and they're like, for me specifically, I'll have people reach out and they go, something like, oh, I'm looking to get shirts made. And then I tell them, okay, roughly for that shirt that you're looking for, it'll be roughly $16 to $18. And they'll say, oh, well, I saw this ad on Instagram where I could get the shirts for $8. And then I have to explain to them, because this isn't it's not a true comparison, because what they were seeing on Instagram for that $8 shirt is probably, it's a screen printed shirt, so you have an order minimum. And then I'll also explain to them, B, it's a one color design. The design you brought to me has 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 colors. So that wouldn't even apply to their promotion that they were running. And most places will charge extra. If they're screen printing, they will charge extra for multiple colors. Whereas here it's one flat rate. You're not getting charged anything else, and we try to keep it pretty simple. So that's the second part. You have to ask, oh, maybe they're not educated about the market conditions, or maybe they weren't aware, or they were maybe misled by, obviously in the age of social media, we get misled all the time by posts that appear one way and then go the other way. I've noticed it a ton in the, garment customization industry. A lot of like false advertising. I've seen I've seen people post stuff like custom shirts for $4, which is pretty insane. That's like nearly the cost of the shirt without even factoring in ink, um, labor, shipping, anything else, right? So there, some of these places are marketing like $4 a shirt, but then like you read the fine print and it's like $4 for the shirt, but then if you want to customize it, then they hook you in with all the other fees, right? So they add all these things on the back end and make it look really appealing up front, like, oh, look at how cheap this is, and then it's not. So we always have to ask that too, and see, like, are people either misled or just misinformed? And then you have to ask yourself, well, did I educate them properly? Because that could be the third piece too, right? If you didn't explain the value of your service to the person properly, and you didn't, really represent yourself that well, then that could be an issue. And that could be the reason why some people don't see the value in your service too. So that's something to look out for too. The whole idea is really just not to let your ego get in the way, because it's really easy to let your ego get in the way. Somebody reaches out to you and you go, here's the price for my service, and then maybe they go, oh, well, I saw it cheaper elsewhere. It's really easy to just go, oh, well, F this person. I'm not even responding to them. They're cheap. They don't, they're cheap. They don't want to pay for stuff. They don't know what good quality is, right? Like, put that ego aside and just go, oh, well, maybe they're just not aware of what I'm doing, or maybe they're not aware of the market. Let me try to talk with them. I've had that happen before where I've talked with people and I kind of explain it, and I always try to be extremely transparent with people too. I'll tell them, like, here is the exact value of my business. My business is valuable for people who are looking to only order a couple of shirts. They might have some complex designs and they want a little bit of a nicer feel. That's what I do. I fulfill those needs. There will be screen printers who can always do it cheaper. They can always produce higher volumes, but that is for people who want to order in higher volumes, right? And I'm transparent. I tell people I'm not the cheapest option. There are cheaper options, but with those cheaper options, there also comes restrictions like minimum order quantities, like restrictions on how many colors you could use or what designs you could use, you know. And you have that conversation. Have that conversation with the customer, explain it to them and talk with them, because if you do that, you'll realize, like, a lot of people aren't necessarily always just running around trying to rip off business owners. There's a lot of people out there who genuinely just don't know, or they were just unaware, right? And granted, you will get your fair share of people too who are like, they are just looking to get the cheapest price, in which case, like, what are you going to do there, right? Those people will always be around, and for them, you just go, all right, well, have a good day. I'll always be here if you need anything in the future. But we have to work on not letting that ego get in the way, and not closing opportunities, right? That's what it says at the beginning. It says it repulses advantages and opportunities, and it's the enemy of repeating and retaining your success, right? We don't want to close doors. We want to keep doors open, keep people, give people options, and maintain those relationships. Even if it's somebody who hasn't ordered from you, it's still important to, if it's on social media or if it's somewhere else, keep those relationships open, you know, very important. So yeah, I mean, what else was it? I think that was it for that first section. Obviously, once again, like, there's a lot more details. He provides a ton of more stories in it, and with a lot more references to real people, anywhere from like war generals to like football coaches to other entrepreneurs, Steve Jobs, and a whole bunch of different stories. So I do recommend people actually go and listen or read the book themselves, because there's a lot more information to gain in there too. But the second part was all about success. And like I said, there's a ton of examples in there, but the one that stood out to me, and which was most interesting, was his example using Genghis Khan with the Mongols. I wouldn't have thought this would be an example that he would use, especially given the nature of the book. I feel like a lot of people think, anybody who knows about Genghis Khan, obviously the Mongols were seen as like kind of this crazy nomadic conquering tribe that was known for being like vicious and very, aggressive, and they would go into villages and, burn and pillage villages and assault the people and all of that. But the one thing that he does do a good job of, Ryan being the author, does do a good job of kind of pulling out the thing that we can learn from them, right? Because regardless of maybe, I don't know if savagery is the best word, but like, regardless of how brutal they were to people, you still kind of have to, in a sense, look at the way that they were able to conquer like such a vast amount of land, especially during that time. Like, there was no like cell phones and text messages where you could like kind of keep track of everything. So to have an empire back in those times was crazy, because you needed to have a very well-oiled machine. And I feel like a lot of people actually didn't recognize this about the Mongols, but he goes on to say, he talks about Genghis Khan, who, aside from all of the conquering and of land and stuff, they would do an interesting thing where every time they would raid a village, they would always try to find the best thinkers, the best doctors, engineers, you know, educators, and they would find those people and kind of make them work for them, right? So they would assimilate their ideas because they knew that regardless of regardless of the circumstances, it's important to constantly keep retaining information. And that's what I believe this chapter was about. The chapter was called Always Stay a Student. So it's it's kind of hard to bridge the gap without reading some of the pretext for this. Um, so once again, I do recommend you go read it yourself. But it was interesting because he talks about them, right? Like they they were kind of nomadic. They were more tribal in the sense that like they stayed moving around and they didn't have like necessarily a super set up place. But every time they would go to a new place, they would conquer it, and then they would learn from those groups. Like they said, they learned to split their raiding tribes into groups of 10, which was an idea that was taken from the Turks at the time. So just once again, like it's that idea of regardless of what you're doing, you want to always stay a student, right? And the way that this ties back into ego from what he was saying in the book was that oftentimes we want to think of ourselves as the expert or the teacher, right? Like, oh, I could say, oh, look at me. I know all of this stuff about how to print you a t-shirt, and I know all this stuff about materials and different inks and different processes, right? But at the same time, I'd have to be honest with myself too. There's a lot that I don't know. And this applies to everybody too. There's always more to learn, right? And it made me actually think while I was reading it, um, going back to the episode that I had with my mom, Jackie, when she was on the podcast, it was interesting because she said, "I know enough to know I don't know enough," right? Which is such an interesting statement because it's true, and I think it's true for everybody. Regardless of how much you know, you'll never really know enough because there's so much information out there and there's always room to learn more things and continue growing. And that's really how he ties in Genghis Khan here. Because the reason for his success in being able to conquer so much land was that he was continuously learning. He was taking the top thinkers of their time period from each, different culture that they came across, and he was taking them, absorbing the information that they were providing, and then implementing it properly. And that's what we need to do as business owners too. You know, um, Even for myself personally, I always think like I try to be open to new ideas and I try to be receptive to things because it is true. Like there's always room to learn, and we never really we should never really stop learning, And that was the idea. He used that story with Genghis Khan. There's a couple other examples that he brings up too, and yeah, I mean, it's just like that's also like it's the founding idea behind this podcast. It's why I wanted to start this podcast because I wanted to listen to entrepreneurs, and I still want to listen to entrepreneurs. Hopefully, we have some more guests on very soon and get their experiences because one of the most valuable ways that I've found I retain information is from hearing stories, right? Because it's a lot more digestible. It's a lot more difficult in a academic setting, and I think a lot of small business owners and entrepreneurial type thinkers can agree to this. In an academic setting, it's a lot more rigid because they're presenting you with like more so the ideas and not necessarily the tangible things that relate the idea to an actual action. And that's also why I thought this book was so well written because he would always relate it back to a real world story. He would never kind of just present you with like the philosophy behind the idea that he was talking about. He would always go, philosophy and then example, or example then lesson that we can learn from that. And by hearing the stories, right? And by doing something like for me personally, doing this podcast, the goal is to hear stories and share stories and really create a bank of information that other small business owners can come across and listen to and hopefully gain something that applies to their business. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. He mentions, also in the parts of success, it's like he talks frequently about not allowing temporary successes to boost your ego too much, right? Because we can get super excited, you close a big sale, you get a big order, maybe if you're selling something, you get put in a really cool store that you wanted to have your product sold in, and we can let our ego get the best of us, right? And what that does is really breed complacency too in a lot of senses. You go sorry, like you go like, well, now that I've done this, I've made it, right? Like I've succeeded, and he makes a good point of saying like that's never the case. That's never the case. To look back and be like I made it is never the case, because there's always more work to be done, and there's you know really what you should be doing is taking pride in the process of it. You should be enjoying the process of the thing that you're doing, right? In that you should be excited to not you shouldn't not that you can't be excited towards end results, because I think that's not true either. Obviously when we achieve stuff, it is good to it is good to acknowledge those things and have some sort of, maybe a little celebration for it. But the idea is like you can't sit on that, right? Um I think I forgot exactly which coach he was referring to, but I think he was referring to one of the football coaches in the book, where he says like they won the Super Bowl, and then they were, he's getting interviewed afterwards, and they were like, well, what are you going to do now? And he's like, well, we go back to work, like they did the thing. They achieved the highest goal that you could achieve in that sport at the highest level. And, the coach is right too. He's like, this is great. We're going to celebrate, but also at the same time, now we're on to the next season, because that's what it is. And I think a lot of people might confuse that with like, oh, well, what type of life is that to live where you can never like celebrate the things? But it's not to say you can't celebrate it. It's just to say that you can't sit in that space too long, because you should always want to keep progressing, you know? So I thought that was important too. Um, Obviously, in small business, the successes, it's the little wins that kind of build up over time, and you just have to keep taking those and keep learning from those, and not necessarily let those be like defining moments, in the sense of like you can't be like, oh well, this is it. But you take that and you go, this was great. I'm super happy and I'm super satisfied with achieving this, but I still have a larger goal that I'd like to achieve, and I'd like to work towards that, right? Because it is important to have a purpose in life. And, you know, if you ask most people like what their purpose is, I wouldn't assume like most people aren't going to name something small. Like usually it's good to have like some sort of, higher purpose, even if you have smaller goals before that keep you motivated to go do something. And it doesn't always have to be that higher purpose doesn't necessarily have to be business related. It could be something more related to humanity or something else. But, the way that we achieve these things in business kind of can progress you towards your overall goal. And then the last section of the book that he talks about, it's part 3. It's called Failure. And this is probably the most interesting portion of the book. Obviously, it is the last portion. And it was interesting for a few reasons, because I think a lot of people don't truly recognize how important failure is in a business setting. Like you kind of need to fail. I think there's another quote from the original book that I was referencing, The Daily Stoic. I can't remember if it was Seneca or one of the other Stoic philosophers that he was quoting, but he says, the quote is, I judge you I think he says, I judge you unfortunate because you've never experienced misfortune, or something like that, right? Like essentially the idea is like you've never failed. You've never failed anything. So like you've never really experienced hardship, which is important for a person. You don't grow by just sitting in the same environment your whole life and nothing changes, right? Like you don't grow as a person from that. You don't grow as a business owner from that. You need to experience failures. You need to have these things come in to your life and kind of rattle that cage a little bit so that you go, oh shit, the way that I was thinking might not be accurate about this. Let me go about this another way. Let me think about a different approach to this. And one of the interesting things that he mentioned was he brought up an example with Steve Jobs. Obviously, he gets talked about a ton, especially in business, because very popular business figure. Everybody knows Apple, everybody knows Steve Jobs, but the lesson still holds true. He talks about Steve Jobs, who was by no means void of ego. Like, he was very egotistical person. There's a ton of stories about him in business, parking in handicapped spots because he thought he could, and running businesses, basically thinking he was like a genius. And eventually where that led him was to get fired from Apple, So it's an interesting story in the sense that, like, even somebody who achieved an insane level of success like Steve Jobs ultimately did experience failure. And I'm sure he experienced failure before that too, but this is the one example that he brings up, right? He does experience this failure, and it's interesting how he dealt with that, right? Because when Steve Jobs was fired from Apple, he went off, in a lot of ways. He had many options. He could have, like, tried to fight tooth and nail to get back into the company. He could have sued or tried to leverage them out, but he didn't, which was interesting because a lot of CEOs or founders try to do that, right? And ultimately what they do is they end up tanking their company. Ryan talked about this as well, because he used to work for American Apparel before, and he was there during the time where their founder was essentially getting into a legal battle with the company. And he goes ahead to talk about how, it basically ruined the company. So in the process of the founder trying to, like, regain control over the thing that he created, he ended up tanking his own creation, which is kind of crazy too. But going back to the Steve Jobs example, he didn't try to do any of that. He wasn't going legal. Wasn't going the legal route. What he did was he went ahead and he accepted that, right? He accepted that failure and he built off of that, and he created a few other companies, one of which was Pixar. And it goes to show, right? Like, experiencing that failure, experiencing a hardship or a struggle, or having that reality check come to you is so important, because then something new can grow out of that. A failure doesn't mean the end, right? It's like, you only, I think there's another quote out there, I don't want to be too corny or anything, but a lot of these times the lessons are true, regardless of if it's a little bit of a cliche or not. But I think the quote is something along the lines of, like, you don't fail until you stop trying, which, yeah, that's pretty true. I mean, yes, you have temporary failures where you, in fact, do not succeed at the task that you're trying, right? Like in business, if you're, if you try to start a company and and you go bankrupt, or, you can't get any orders or whatever, right? You've technically failed, right? But the overall idea of that saying is really to say, like, a temporary failure, you don't have to make that a permanent failure. That could be something that's temporary, and you can flip it and use it as a learning experience, which most people should do. If you want to be a successful person in business, and I've seen this so far in just the people that I've talked to and my own experiences, like, you need to be okay with not always succeeding. There's plenty of sales that I've not closed. People who've wanted to order shirts and I couldn't necessarily get them across the finish line. People who wanted to order other stuff, and that's okay, right? Because each time I talk to a person and I'm not able to maybe convert a sale, or each time I, get stuck in a situation where, like, maybe I'm running low on some liquidity or some cash and I need to find some cash otherwise, it makes me more versatile. It makes me figure out what I need to do, and from that I get better, right? I learn a new skill. I figure out a new method of, kind of getting around that problem, and for that I get better, And the same rule applies to anybody who is running a business. You need to be okay with the failure. It's a part of it, right? And I think that's a part of life too, in general. If you wanted to, I don't want to go too far outside of the scope of the business realm, but they say it's the same thing too. If maybe if you're not starting a business, but you're, maybe trying to get into a relationship or something, right? Like you might start talking to a person, right? And it might fail. They might stop talking to you, or they might not be interested, right? But you learn from that and you go, oh, well, maybe the person wasn't interested in me, or B, maybe I came across a little weird just because I was a little nervous, right? And as you become more experienced, right, and you attain these failures, you become more comfortable. So same thing in business, right? When somebody says, oh, that's, if somebody comes to me and now they say, oh, well, I wasn't really looking to pay that much for a shirt. I was kind of looking for something a little bit more affordable. I have the knowledge and some of the past experiences, and I'm able to work off that and go, oh, well, yeah, I mean, I totally understand that. There's definitely cheaper options, but just so you know, like a lot of screen printers who are cheaper, you're going to make you order a lot more. This option is great in your circumstance because, you don't have to put out a ton of upfront cash. You can do a pre-order and only order what you've sold, and basically not have any like sitting stock or money that's being invested into this product that you didn't need to invest. But I have those answers and those ways of talking about things because I've experienced being confronted with that and maybe not knowing what to say, especially early on. But you learn from these things, and that's kind of all you can do. The last part of the last section that I thought was interesting, we've kind of alluded to it in I guess the earlier part too, but I think one of the chapters is called "The Effort is Enough." Right. And this is the idea of not letting that ego once again feed into you needing recognition, right? Like you don't always need to be reminded of how good you did, right? And that's something, listen, anybody who knows me might probably knows that I'm been guilty of it too. I love recognition. I think everybody does enjoy it, right? Because ego to a certain degree is something that's kind of natural, right? So people do enjoy being recognized, but that also at the same time doesn't mean that we did the work explicitly for the recognition. Ryan says the effort is enough because, sometimes because when you do something, right, you want to take pride in the actual act. You don't want to necessarily only take pride in receiving credit for it. And I'm blanking on exactly the example, the person that he references in the story, but I think he was talking about something in ancient Rome. This person was like a close advisor to the king or whatever. And he was a close advisor to this person. He helped the government run smoothly. He did all of these things to keep that person in power. And ultimately at the end of it, the king like sentences him to exile and even I think blinds him and like takes all of his money away and maintains it and basically strips him of everything that he's done. Right. But in the end of it, the lesson from that was like he retains still the fact that like he has the effort at the end of it. And it's not easy too, because I'm sure some people hear that and they're like, well, that sucks. Like, why would anybody willingly sign up for that? Right. And I don't think anybody would necessarily willingly sign up for it. But the lesson is, if you did something that you took pride in and you took pride in your work and you did the work and you put forth the effort, right? At the end of the day, they can't take that away from you because that's something that you have developed within yourself. You can take pride in your work and say, regardless of what I have now, I can at least take solace in the fact that I put everything forth towards this goal. I've attempted to achieve something, and that is a lot. more than what other people can say, especially in small business, right? You'll probably hear a lot of your friends or family members, they might be mildly supportive, but ultimately they don't sound too enthusiastic about it. Or you get maybe the one person who goes, "You sure you want to do that?" And you have to be confident in yourself as a business owner, and then also be confident in the fact that, well, yeah, I mean, I acknowledge that this might not work out, but I also am not doing this necessarily just for the sole purpose of it working out. I'm doing this because this is something that I'm passionate about, and this is something that or this is something that I believe brings value to people. And the end result, the overall end result doesn't matter. Even if I'm temporarily able to provide value for people and make this something that works, then that's a win, right? I guess that's kind of the way you have to look at it. I don't know. So I guess overall, kind of wrapping this up, some of the takeaways that I got from this book. Definitely number one, stop talking about what you want to do and just do it, right? So that was the first part. You don't need to come up with the perfect plan before you do something. You just need to literally go ahead and go do that thing. Second thing that I took away from this was go into it knowing that you don't know enough. Be open to learn, right? You need to go into your business endeavor, go into your everyday work for your company, right? Knowing that there's always opportunities to learn and being open to people learning, right? And also being open to receiving information from different places, as a younger person, right? I feel like a lot of younger people can relate to this too, where you basically get written off. You get written off by older people, adults who think that they know more than you. And in many cases, like, yes, they might know more than you in a much more general sense, right? They have more life experience, but maybe you have something to offer still, right? And that applies to everybody. You need to go into something recognizing that, that's like kind of the flip side of it. You still need to go into things recognizing that you might get knowledge from somebody who's younger than you. You might get knowledge from somebody that's older than you, or somebody who's done something that's totally unrelated to the industry or business that you're running, but they still might have something of value to share with you. So always be accepting of that. The third thing was to make sure you're providing real value. And I would love to talk about this more in a future episode, because, I did reference it a bit when I was talking about, people thinking about their pricing, because that really is what it's about. Like, you want to make sure you're really providing the value that you're charging for. But there's a whole bunch more to talk about. And that also sunk in throughout the book too. He was talking about, make sure that you're being honest with yourself and providing the value that you need. The second one, or the last one, was, do not expect or look for credit. Let the action of the thing be enough. So that's what we talked about in this last part. Not everything is done for credit. Some things are just done for the sake of saying that you've done them. The last thing that I took away from this, and I said this kind of at the beginning too and throughout, it's sweep the floor. So once again, that's the idea of constantly checking your ego. He kind of compares ego to dust and dirt, in that regardless of how many times you sweep, there will always be more dust. There will always be more dirt that kind of deposits itself on the ground, and you need to take the time to continuously go over the thing, make sure you're doing it properly, and make sure you're continuously checking that ego, continuously working on yourself to be the best entrepreneur and person that you can be, because ultimately that's going to affect your business and how successful you are in business. So yeah, those are the main takeaways that I took from this book. Once again, the book is called Ego is the Enemy. It's by Ryan Holiday. I highly recommend anybody in business, or even anybody who's not running a business, who just wants to kind of learn more about themselves, read this book. There's a ton of amazing things to take away from it, and I really enjoyed listening to it. So yeah, hopefully in the next few episodes, we're going to have some more guests. I'm going to try to book some more people so that we can continue hearing stories from other entrepreneurs, continue learning from their stories, and having that to add to our own wealth of knowledge. So stay tuned for that in the future. As always, we're on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify, as well as Apple Podcasts. So make sure you go follow us on all the things, hit all the buttons, subscribe, like, whatever. um, we're always looking for more guests too. So if you do know anybody who would be good on the podcast, who owns a business or, has owned a business, please send them our way. We'd love to hear their story and, get in touch with them so that we can share their story with that. And yeah, with that being said, thank you for listening. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye, everybody.